Well, good morning, church, and we could just pray and be done right now and be blessed, right? I got a hearty amen for that one in some corners. Thank you, Senior Adult Choir. What a blessing. I wore my outfit. I didn't get the memo about the dark slacks, though, or I would have just fit right in. But thanks again for blessing us. Just on a side note about that, I was reflecting about the input that senior adults made in my life. When I was 13, my Sunday school teacher, they didn't have enough to teach the kids. And so they were recruiting senior adults to take on the arduous task of a room full of 13-year-olds, if you can imagine that. And I witnessed at least one fight in that class, by the way, so the task was great. But Glenn Merrill would pick me up every Tuesday and take me to visit people in the community. And he'd pick me up every Saturday and buy me donuts and talk about the lesson for the next day and say, I need your help to pray every day. And he was long in the tooth in those days. And I just remember that and just reflected. We have so much wisdom cross generations that sometimes we forget about. So thank you, seniors, for blessing us and for investing in our lives. If you're on the search committee, I just ask you to stand real quick. This is big time week, a couple weeks for them as we're drawing, I'm not saying drawing to a close, but we're getting closer. And so we need to really be lifting them up in prayer. And so, hey, Joe Reed, would you pray for the search committee for us and pray that God would give us some discipline and some discernment in these days as we get closer? Please, thank you. Amen. Thank you, committee. Well, today's not a first for me, but it's a first in a long time. As I stood there Wednesday night talking and listening to some feedback, I was tapped on the shoulder by the Holy Spirit that said, what I had planned for this morning wasn't what we needed to talk about this morning. And I'm like, okay, well, I have a job, and I try to stay ahead in these things. And you're going to interrupt my schedule on Wednesday, and you haven't told me what I need to share on Sunday. But I really felt like as the week progressed that I wanted to give you, the church at large, kind of a picture of where we've been on Wednesdays and what we've been doing. So if you've been attending or coming in and out, some of this will sound a little familiar, but I just wanted the body as a whole because I really feel like the Lord's been working through some things. So we're going to look at that. So if you want to go to 1 Samuel 13, we're going to be looking at 1 Samuel 13 and 14. We've been there for about 5 weeks, and I'm not going to cram 5 weeks into 1 hour or actually 25 minutes, but I am going to spend some time there. 1 Samuel 13. My first cell phone was a Nokia. I don't know how many of you had one of those, but in 1993, I felt like I hit the big time. We were actually, Margaret was still in school. I just finished my master's and got hired, and Margaret was enrolled in the doctorate program, and, we didn't have a lot of cash in those days, although I guess in hindsight it felt like we did. But, cell phones were a rarity in 93 for my peers, if you will, and I got a job, and they said, we'll pay for your cell phone. So I ran out and got a Nokia. Well, that wasn't too uncommon in those days. Nokia was a pretty popular brand. But if you were really in the money in 1993, you had a Motorola. And in 96, if you were in the money, you bought a $1,000 Motorola StarTAC. It was about that big, and it's a flip phone. It was interesting because at that time, over 65% of the market was owned by Motorola, the number one cell phone dealer they created the first commercial cell phone, brought it to the market, and because of that, they just exploded in growth, and they owned over 60% of the market. In 1998, Nokia took them over. Okay, little competition, a European company. And at that point, Nokia owned about 60% of the market. As of today, Motorola owns about 7% of the market, which is good because a year and a half ago they had 0.7% of the market, and they had gone bankrupt. Nokia just sold their cell phone operations to Microsoft. They were out of business. They couldn't compete. It's a fascinating look at an organization that at once was the most dominant player in an industry completely go bankrupt and lose their money and lose their focus and lose their vision about what they were doing. Now, there's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of research. Business schools look at it and they study it. But those aren't the only two examples. Kmart, right? Used to be huge. Everybody went to a Kmart. Circuit City burst on the scenes, exploded in growth, and there was one in every major metropolitan area, bankrupt. It's not just organizations. In 1983, I joined the staff of Emmanuel Baptist Church in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and it was exploding. It was so exciting to be a part of that congregation. Mike Huckabee was the pastor. We were flush every Sunday. You couldn't get a seat. The parking lots were full. Our the youth group was just exploding with kids. We were doing things that nobody had done. We integrated in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. We integrated the congregation, integrated the youth group. It was just an amazing time. The church doesn't exist today. My home church, First Baptist Forest City, we used to take 7 buses to Siloam Springs, the campment over there, and over 200 kids. We would regularly baptize 125 to 130 people per year annually for about 12 years. They run 230 in service a day, and they'd do lucky if they baptized 10 today. What happened? What happened to Motorola? What happened to Nokia? What happened to Emmanuel? What happened to First Baptist Forest City? Simple. They forgot what they were about. Their mission never changed, but their vision on how they accomplished that mission got lost in the shuffle. The mission, to me, is simple for us as Christ followers. Jesus says, go and make disciples. But he gives us a lot of latitude on how you do that. Some churches put all their energies in building the most dynamic children's ministry, or music ministry, or bus ministry, or youth ministry, or Sunday school, and they put all their resources toward that, and they champion that, and they drive it, and they drive it, and because of that, they thrive and they succeed. Isn't it interesting that when churches enter a time of debt, meaning they decide to build a building, for many, it's the most successful growth period in the life of a church. They just take on this huge debt, but it gives everybody a rallying cry. It gives them a vision of what they need to be about in this next season of time. Structurally, a mission doesn't change. Go and make disciples transcends all generations. There's never an excuse or a pass on fulfilling the Great Commission. It's for all believers. Go and make disciples. The how we do that should change. It does change. And one of the things to think about is that we think about the various opportunities of way we can work and be different. And one of the ways to do that is we assess the opportunities as a church, and we assess the threats to our church, and then we make a course correction on our vision to meet that. Where is God moving? Experiencing God used to say that back in the 90s. You find where God's moving, and you go get a part of that, and you be a part of that, and watch God explode in that area. So the way you do that is you assess 3 to 5 years out. Where do we want to be in 3 to 5 years? Where is God moving? What does God want us to do? And you look at the opportunities, you look at the threats, and then you set a vision to help you get there. That adjusted vision matches strengths and needs of the community. It matches strengths and needs of this church. Think about it this way. In history, Sunday school started. Why? Because schools were so rural and underfunded, the church saw an opportunity to set up this structure, Sunday school, where they could bring in these kids who during the week couldn't afford to miss work, because work consisted of working on the farm, providing sustenance to their family. They were part of the cog in the wheel that fed the community, and so they really couldn't take off to go to school. So churches created Sunday school, and it met a need in the community of lost people. So kids come, and guess what? They use curriculum called the Bible to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's the history of Sunday school. What a vision, right? Somewhere that vision changed. Think about potluck dinners. Their origin was not just to have fun. Their origin was to pool resources. Churches would get together and they could have dinner on the grounds and everybody bring what they had, and together there was enough to feed everyone. And oh, by the way, it was a great fellowship tool as well. Things of that nature came because people looked at opportunities. The potluck was an opportunity to fellowship. So, if you're not in a building campaign and you aren't really focusing your energies in one direction, what is the vision of your church? This question really rocked my world a couple weeks ago, and it set me on a journey to try to rectify something that possibly I failed in, and that was one of the committee members, search committee members, said, a couple of the candidates said, "Hey, what's the vision of your church?" What's the answer to that? Right? What are you about? What are you doing? What are you accomplishing? So how would you answer that? So let's go to the scriptures. The children of Israel went through periods of trust followed by periods of rebellion. And to me, it didn't always make sense. For many years prior to where we're at today, they were managed by prophets. Now, prophets were the people who ruled over the children of Israel. In fact, they're kind of like traveling itinerant judges and preachers, all wrapped up in one. The first part of Samuel tells us that Eli was going to this region. He would set up and he would hold court, and he would make judgments for the people in this region. Then he would go to another one and do the same thing. But he was also the mouthpiece for God. God would speak to the children of Israel through the prophets. And Samuel was one such judge. He was prophet when the children of Israel cried out and wanted a king. I don't know if you remember, but the reason they said they wanted a king is because they wanted to be like everyone else. All the nations that were around them, the Philistines and the Amorites in particular, that were holding them in slavery and bondage and taking their greatest resources, they had kings. So if they've got one, perhaps we need one. Now, the mission for the children of Israel was found in Deuteronomy, that every Hebrew child knew: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That was impressed literally in their homes from the day they could walk and talk. They knew that was their mission. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Obey God by loving Him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Now, their vision changed from time to time. When they were in Egypt, their vision was for liberty and freedom. When they were wandering the desert, their vision was to survive the desert because they made one bad choice after another, right? So then they had 40 years where the literal vision was, we got to make it through this 40 years. When they came at the end of that 40 years, their vision was, we got to go take that land. That's the land that God has given us. Our marching orders for today, our mission is still to love God. One of the ways we can love God is take the land that He said is ours, in spite of all the obstacles. So the children of Israel cried out for a king, and Samuel took it personally, and he went before the Lord, and the Lord said, hey, don't worry about it. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. So after listening to the hard hearts, God decided to honor the request, and He gives them the king. Now, here's what He told them, and we'll pick up the scriptures in just a minute. I'm getting this to 13. He says, if you get a king, he's going to take 1/10 of your income. He's going to enslave your slaves. He's going to take your strongest men and make them warriors and take them to his army. He's going to take the food, a portion of the food that you produce, and he's going to give it to the affluent. He's going to give it to others. So if you want a king, I'll give you a king. And that's what he did. And it says he gave him Saul. And at the end of Saul's day, we know Saul's days were marred by war. The Philistines had enslaved and abused the Israelites for many years, and Saul's job was to free them from the bondage. And Samuel gave him a job description of how kings are to behave, but at the end of the day, for that period of time, his mission, his vision was to free the people. So let's look at it. 1 Samuel 13. This is important. Verse 1, Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 42 years. Saul selected 3,000 special troops from the army of Israel and sent the rest of the men home. He took 2,000 of the men chosen with him to Michmash in the hill country of Bethel. The other 1,000 went with Saul's son Jonathan to Gibeah in the land of Benjamin. Soon after this, Jonathan attacked and defeated the garrison of Philistines at Geba. The news spread quickly among the Philistines. So Saul blew the ram's horn throughout the land, saying, Hebrews, hear this. Rise up and revolt. He's given them a flag to capture. Rise up and revolt. Verse 4. All Israel heard the news that Saul had destroyed the Philistine garrison at Geba, and the Philistines now hated the Israelites more than ever. So the entire Israelite army was summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. The Philistines mustered an army, listen to this in verse 5, of 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and as many warriors as the giants of sand, as the grains of sand on the seashore. They camped at Michmash east of Beth-aven. The men of Israel saw what a tight spot were they in, and because they were pressed by the enemy, they tried to hide in caves, thickets, rocks, holes, and cisterns. Some of them crossed the Jordan River and escaped into the land of Gad and Gilead. Meanwhile, Saul stayed at Gilgal, and his men were trembling with fear. Saul waited there 7 days for Samuel, as Samuel had instructed him earlier, but Samuel didn't come. Saul realized that his troops were rapidly slipping away, so he demanded, bring me the burnt offering and the peace offerings. And Saul sacrificed the burnt offering himself. Just as Saul was finishing with burnt offering, Samuel arrived. Saul went out to meet and welcome him, but Samuel said, what is this you have done? Saul replied, I saw my men scattering from me, and you didn't arrive when you said you would, and the Philistines are at Michmash ready for battle. So I said, the Philistines are ready to march against us at Gilgal, and I haven't even asked for the Lord's help. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering myself before you came. Verse 13, how foolish, Samuel exclaimed. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God gave you. Had you kept it, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom must end, for the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The Lord has already appointed him to be the leader of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. Verse 22, so on the day of battle, none of the people of Israel had a sword or a spear except for Saul and Jonathan. Go to chapter 14. One day Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come on, let's go over to where the Philistines have their outposts. But Jonathan did not tell his father what he was doing. Meanwhile, Saul and his 600 men were camped at the outskirts of Gibeah around the pomegranate tree at Migron. To reach the Philistine outpost, Jonathan had to go between two rocky cliffs that were called Bozez and Sina. The cliff on the northwest was in front of Michmash, and the one on the south was in front of Geba. Let's go across to the outposts of those pagans, Jonathan said to his armor bearer. Perhaps the Lord will help us, for nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few. Do what you think is best, the armor bearer replied. I'm with you completely wherever you decide. All right then, Jonathan told him, we will cross over and let them see us. If they say to us, stay where you are or we will kill you, then we will stop and not go to them. But if they say, come on up and fight, then we will go up. That will be the Lord's sign that he will help us defeat them. When the Philistines saw them coming, they shouted, look, the Hebrews are crawling out of their holes. Then the men from the outpost shouted to Jonathan, come on up here, we'll teach you a lesson. Come on, climb up right behind me, Jonathan said to his armor bearer, for the Lord will help us defeat them. So they climbed up using both hands and feet, and the Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed those who came behind him. They killed some 20 men in all, and their bodies were scattered over about a half an acre. Suddenly, panic broke out in the Philistine army, both in the camp and in the field, including even the outposts and raiding parties. And just then, an earthquake struck, and everyone was terrified. Skip down to verse 20. Then Saul and his men rushed out to the battle and found the Philistines killing each other. There was terrible confusion everywhere. Verse 21. Even the Hebrews who had previously gone over to the Philistine army revolted and joined in with Saul, Jonathan, and the rest of the Israelites. Likewise, the men of Israel were hiding in the hill country of Ephraim, joined the chase when they saw the Philistines running away. Verse 23, so the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle continued to rage even beyond Beth-aven. So let's look at quickly through the characters. There's a lot here. Saul, he was a king chosen by God. He was the first one. The Bible describes him as being a head and shoulders taller than anybody else, and he was handsome. Essentially, he was only on the job for about 2 weeks. If you read up to this point, he'd been chosen as king. He goes home to work the fields. We don't know how long he did that. But when one of the communities of Israel was attacked, it made Saul angry. And then he kicked in as king, and he called all the children of Israel, and they went and defeated the Amorites and freed that village. But it's interesting, Jonathan led, in this case, Jonathan led them in the first defeat of the Philistines. And yet Saul took the credit. Jonathan led them in battle with 1,000 men. Saul had 2,000 men over the other area. But Saul sent out the news, children of Israel vote. And the news was that Saul had defeated the Philistines. But it was Jonathan. Samuel the prophet sent him ahead and said, I will be there in 7 days, so wait on me. But that day came, and Saul's impatience caused him to do something he shouldn't have done. He led the men in a very spiritual exercise. He was the king, and he said, well, we do burnt offerings. Let's do a burnt offering. It was a very religious exercise. Most people would go, well, that's pretty cool. He led the people. The problem was, it wasn't his job. That's not what kings do. That's what the priests were for. And in their day, their priests represented. They were the voice of the Lord. They represented God before the people. And Saul took on that because he wanted to do it on his terms. Tragic sense. When that happens, Samuel arrives as soon as the fire is going out, and he smells it and said, what have you done? This is fascinating. On verse 1 in chapter 13, it tells us he reigned for 42 years. But this day, essentially 2 weeks into his kingdom, Samuel tells him, your days as king are numbered. Unbelievable. Sometimes God gives us a leader, and because of his behavior, we miss out on God's best. Sometimes the leader starts well, but finishes poorly. Sometimes the leader appears very religious. He set up an altar, offered burnt offerings. It was a religious exercise. It had a special place in their worship, but it wasn't his role. Sometimes leaders assume roles and responsibilities that God didn't appoint or intend for them to have. He wasn't a priest and shouldn't have acted like one. It's interesting to note that in spite of all that, Saul still had a group of men that supported him. It described the army fragmenting, but about 600 of them stayed with him. And we find him sitting under a pomegranate tree with his men around him, wondering what they're supposed to be doing. But they weren't doing anything. So Saul failed to keep the mission and the vision of the children of Israel. He was supposed to be winning the battle. We find him sitting under a tree, trembling with fear. Jonathan, his son, here's an interesting young man. He's the king's son, but we find him having a momentary lapse of forgetfulness because he forgets who he is, because he wants to do God's business, not his earthly father's. He remembers who his real father is. When they arrive on the scene, Jonathan leads in battle. When the men are scattering and it's looking pretty dim, it's Jonathan who takes action and allows God to use him. He puts himself at the greatest point of opportunity. Jonathan exercised great faith. He faced the Philistine outpost with only he and his sword bearer. When they called him up, he knew God had given him the victory. But remember what he said. He said to his armor bearer, they left the camp. Nobody knew he was gone. He said, perhaps the Lord will give us victory. because God can use many or a few. It doesn't take an army with God. His declaration of perhaps is a bold question that took courage. He exercised great faith and he exercised great courage. He also knew the nature of God. God can deliver. God can use just one. He knew that, and he exercised that, and he exhibited that in his action, and he showed great determination. It said that he had to climb the cliffs with hand and feet just to get to the place of the Philistines to fight them. This was no walk in the park. He didn't walk up to them or ride his bike up to them or drive his car. He climbed hand and feet up the rocky face of the cliff just so he and his armor bearer could take on the entire Philistine outpost. Jonathan was a quiet leader. No one knew he had left the camp. He didn't seek fame. He didn't seek attention. He didn't ask for it. He didn't say, "Here, look at me," but silently left because he knew God had given him a vision to take the land back and free the people. They had to take roll just to see who was missing. He didn't want the credit, and he didn't proclaim what he was about to do. He just did it. Jonathan understood his role and the role God played in the battle. The battle was and is the Lord's. Do what you're called to do. The children of Israel had a role too. They cried out for a king. God gave them Saul. Initially, they rallied behind him, and he amassed a fairly large army. But when the Philistines' army responded, they sent that army, that 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and it was described as more men than grains of sand. They were outnumbered, they were surrounded, and they began to flee. What a leader. They didn't want to go to battle because they knew it was going to cost them something. They felt like they had nothing to win. It wasn't really about a king anyway. Many people were just going to gripe. And like spoiled children, when they get what they wanted, they finally got the king, but they never intended to follow him in the first place. You know how kids are. I want. You get it to them, and then they don't ever play with it, right? You know, the children of Israel were just like that. They begged, but they didn't follow. Many fled in 3 different directions. It's interesting to note. Some of them went to live among the Philistines. They were basically traders. Some went in rocks and hills and cisterns. They scattered. But some of them went home. There was a group of them that stayed, but they were blind followers. They were content to sit under the tree with Saul. Even though some might have thought different, it didn't push them to action. The last thing about these children of Israel, some wanted to be a part only when things looked good. They didn't mind being a part when the victory was good, because when the battle turns, what did it say? They all came back. Success brings the naysayers to the table. Success brings those who are hiding in the caves and want to be spectators, brings them to the room. They came out from their hiding. They returned from home. They came from being traitors to get in on what God was doing. I think some of those who left weren't afraid, but rather lost interest in just sitting around. And so rather than sit with Saul under the tree or go hide, they just lost interest, so they went home. But perhaps they were fighters and Saul didn't fight, so they left. So when it was re-engaged, they all wanted in on it. The children of Israel forgot their mission from God. They forgot their vision. They weren't loving God, and they weren't taking the land that God had given them. The last thing is resources. They were outnumbered, and the Bible says there were only 2 swords in the entire Israelite army, Saul and Jonathan. When the Philistines enslaved the children of Israel, they got rid of all the blacksmiths. So if you had a plowshare or a sickle for the wheat, you had to go to a Philistine blacksmith to get it sharpened, because they knew if there were blacksmiths, there would be swords. And the Bible clearly says that the Philistines had taken all the resources away from the men of Israel to have the ability to make war. So they're literally coming against the Philistine army with plowshares and sickles and clubs and sticks and rocks. That's all they had. But what God calls you to do, He will resource. God called them to defeat the Philistines and gave them everything they needed, even if it didn't look like what they wanted. They didn't see any swords, but it didn't stop Jonathan and his armor bearer. So here's how we land the plane. Our responsibility is to know, love, and serve God. It's we as individuals who are responsible for how we use what God has given us. There is an inherent personal responsibility to your relationship with Christ that's outside of the bigger context, but it's what you do with what God has given you. We need to do a better job of realizing that each of us play a part, and that's what's really important. We all have a role. Religious exercise and ceremony is not the same thing as obedience. It's not. You can come to church and still be disobedient. You can have perfect attendance records Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and be disobedient to God's call on your life. Saul's sacrifice seemed right, but it wasn't. We would do well to strive to work and do what God has called each of us to do. And sometimes we as Christians put people in a role they aren't designed to handle. They do good in a small thing, and we think, oh, we ought to put them over here, when in reality, they were doing exactly what God wanted them to do in the first place. Do your part in the kingdom. It may be an armor bearer. Jonathan's armor bearer, it's a thankless position. But what an incredible role and an incredible story. Jonathan falls the 25, and the armor bearer kills him because he's doing his role. It's a thankless job, but he did it. Do your part in building God's kingdom. You were made for it. Don't blindly follow. Saul should have been an immediate picture of those who have the title but aren't leading to victory. Content to take the credit, pass the blame, and yet sit under a pomegranate tree. Don't blindly follow. Clarify the win. If you know where you're going and what you're going to do, do it. Jonathan knew that they were to defeat the Philistines, and so the only way to do that was to engage. He couldn't sit under the tree. It wasn't in him. He wanted to be obedient. So what does victory look like for Elmdale? What does engagement look like for you? The reality is you have to engage, and then you'll see God's provisions. If you engage in a vision that seems daunting to the task, God will resource and provide. No, God provides even though it looks ominous. They only had 2 swords, but Jonathan knew it was enough. We can pick a flag to capture and not only know where the resources are coming from, but know that God's plan always includes equipping those that He calls. What's He calling you to do? He always has, and He always does. The question for the pastoral candidate, from the pastoral candidates, what's your church's vision? Should bug us a little bit. We should be able to roll it off our tongue. We should know where we're going. Faith is action. The scriptures say we battle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities. We are in internal combat against an enemy that seeks to kill, steal, and destroy. What role does your faith and action require from you? What role do you play in Elmdale's vision? You don't need a senior pastor to get going. What you need is a vision. So the last thing I want to mention, the enemy for the Israelites was bold. They would come out and mock them. The Philistines would stand and shout at them, hurl accusations about them, taunt them. This is God's army. And he was bold and brazen. To me, the enemy's bold today. He's attacking our family. He's hijacking the discourse among Christians. The lost world controls the dialogue on many of the key issues that we face today. Christians' voices are silent. The enemy is bold. He will do everything he can to undermine your family. Our families are fractured. Our marriages are struggling. He is bold. He attacks our families, our pride, our confidence, and we end up complacent, scared, and still. The Bible says we are more than conquerors through him. So will you take up your plowshares and join the battle? Let's stand and pray. Father, I'm grateful for this people. I'm grateful that you're a God that is cheering us on. You're standing